This one. Yes, here we go. Welcome everybody. It's the 14th of July 2014. This is UCY.tv with the Solvinur event. Today I have a guest. You can check out his website, jawest.net. And his name is John Anthony West. He was born January 1st, 1932.
No,
No?
no, that's somebody put that up on Wikipedia.
Correct.
And and I don't know who did it. It should have been corrected. In fact, I thought it was corrected. It's July 9th, 1932.
All
so
right.
not that matters.
All right. It's okay. If there's anything else wrong from Wikipedia, just interrupt me and take it from there, okay? He's an American author, lecturer, guide, and proponent of the Sphinx water erosion hypothesis in geology. Influenced by R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, in 1993, his work with Robert M. Schoch, a geologist and associate professor of natural science at the College of General Studies at Boston University, was presented by Charles Heston in an NBC special called The Mystery of the Sphinx, that won West a News and Documentary Emmy Award for Best Research and a nomination for the Best Documentary. All right, John, welcome.
Thanks for the introduction. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there's another thing I wanted to mention. There's books available on the website. Serpents in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt, The Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt, and The Mystery of the Sphinx. You also did a book on astrology. Is that in reprint yet?
No, it isn't, but it's fairly soon it will be. We've scanned it in, and I think I have to do some editing and maybe a new forward for it. But it will be back self-published in print in the not too distant future, but I can't say when.
All right. Awesome. So, John, can you tell us a little bit about your book, Serpents in the Sky?
Yes, Serpent in the Sky is an introduction to the work of the amazing French genius with the unpronounceable name that you, in fact, pronounce pretty well, R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, and who was an extraordinary character, mystic, Orientalist, practicing alchemist, profound scholar, Pythagorean, all of those things. Born in 1890 or 91, and a boy genius. He was doing lectures for the Theosophists at the age of 16, mainly on Pythagorean mathematics.
Wow.
And he probably knew more about the Western Hermetic disciplines than anybody else in recent years. But he didn't get into Egypt until the middle 30s, when he went to Egypt with his wife. His wife was independently wealthy, so he was lucky. He never had to work for or at least didn't need to make enough money to live on to carry out his studies. And went to Egypt. I made the mistake of this actually in Serpent in the Sky, because I thought he just went on a holiday, but he, in fact, later works came out that clarified this point. He went in order to see if indeed the Hermetic disciplines were as the Renaissance astrologers, numerologists, magicians, etc., Neoplatonists, all of those scholars of the Renaissance claimed that their disciplines went back to ancient Egypt, but there wasn't no evidence that they, or in the modern sense of the word, no hard evidence that in fact they did. So Schwaller traveled to Egypt with his wife in 1937, mainly looking to see if he could verify that Egypt had the basic knowledge. And what he was looking for was specifically, he was a mathematician himself and a great geometer. He was looking to see if the Egyptians knew and utilized the so-called golden section, the harmonic measure, the perfect proportion. It's called the golden ratio, it's often called. And with it, it's closely associated Fibonacci series. To make a very long story short, because I tell the story of Serpent in the Sky in the book, he quickly found out that indeed they did use it, including also its spin-off into the diatonic scale, the musical scale. And he had, in visiting the Temple of Luxor, he had what, let's say, mystics call a revelation, and poets call an inspiration, and scientists call a hypothesis formation, in order to make it sound as unmagical and as boring as possible. So what Schwaller's revelation was that this strange temple with its asymmetric, skewed axis was in fact an exercise in harmony and proportion. And he set about trying to prove that, and very quickly did. And as I said, not only did he prove that they were using the golden section and Fibonacci series and the diatonic scale and the harmonics in the proportions and measures of this particular temple, but by extension, all of the temples as well, he was able to show that they were using it. And the Temple of Luxor is built in stages, but most of it was built around 1300 BC. In other words, a good 800 years before the rise of Greek civilization, who are, to this day, Pythagoras is credited with being the discoverer of the golden section and of the laws of harmony and so on. So what Schwaller was doing, by showing that all of these mathematical concepts were expressed in the Temple of Luxor in a much more sophisticated fashion than the Greeks ever envisaged, he was pushing back the boundaries of exact knowledge of that kind of mathematical harmonic knowledge back roughly 1,000 years before the Greeks employed it. And by extension, it would go back to the very beginnings of dynastic Egypt. So in other words, this was groundbreaking work, and Schwaller recognized it as such, and ended up staying from 1937 to 52, studying mostly the Temple of Luxor and putting together what both adherents, supporters, admirers like myself of Schwaller's work, and his opponents call the symbolist school of Egyptology, which sees and demonstrates a high science, sacred science, which in modern rationalist terms is almost a contradiction in terms. I mean, to the modern rationalist, atheist scholar, sacred is just a polite word for superstition. Schwaller took a very opposite point of view, and so do I.
All right.
And anyway, he by the time he was finished with the 15 years that he'd spent there, as I said, mostly at Luxor, he had reformulated the sacred science of the ancients in a manner that was accessible to our over-rationalized contemporary intellects, and in magisterial fashion. But when I encountered his work, and this is a long story that I will tell one of these days in an autobiography or something of the sort, so I can't really get into it here, but when I encountered this work, I was myself involved, and still am, in the school that follows the teachings of G.I. Gurdjieff. And what Schwaller was doing was with impeccable detailed scholarship, effectively proving all of the stuff that Gurdjieff was talking about on a take it or leave it basis. Gurdjieff couldn't have cared less about the scholarship. But Schwaller, inadvertently, they never knew each other, even though they were both living in Paris at the same time. They never knew each other, but it was a detailed scholarly demonstration of what the ancient sacred science was and how it worked. Problem with it was that it was only in French at that time. I really actually had to learn French in order to read the book. And I couldn't get a copy of the book. It was even though it was published in 57, I could not find a copy of it. I was living in London at the time, so I went every day for almost a year to the library, learning French and plowing through Schwaller, which unfortunately, in French, and now it's a wonderful English translation, but Schwaller is pretty impenetrable. You need a certain kind of, what Schwaller calls thinking with the heart. Great line. If all you can do is think with your head, you can't penetrate Schwaller or anything else that's sacred, as it were. But so I had a big chapter it was my first scholarly book, actually. I started out as a novelist, playwright, satirist, and that's almost my favorite hat to wear rather than my Egyptological pith helmet. And when I read that book, so in the astrology book, which was my first nonfiction book, I included at the beginning a long chapter on Schwaller's symbolist interpretation, even though it really didn't belong there. But I couldn't resist. And then publishers came to me. I'd already had quite a lot of things published and produced, theater and so on. Nothing that made any money. Still the same now, and I've just turned 82, and I'm still broke. Anyway, anyhow, the publishers came to me and asked me if I would do a book on Schwaller. And I said, you bet. And so 6 years later, out came The Serpent in the Sky, which introduced, and because I'm a writer by trade, this is a problem with very often, it's not uncommon that great creative individual minds like Schwaller's have trouble communicating to a general audience what they've done, because they're working at such a level that they really don't forget what lesser people are capable of understanding. And me, I was sort of somewhere in the middle. I could really understand most of Schwaller pretty well, but because I am a writer, I was able to, by trade, I'm a writer, I'm a scholar by default. So I was able to put it into language that was still not bedtime reading by any means. It's not the Da Vinci Code, but at least it makes Schwaller's extraordinary work accessible. And of course, nothing of Schwaller was in English at that time. I'm talking about the early 70s now. Now virtually everything he's written has been translated, and mostly it's been translated very well, but that still doesn't make it terribly penetrable. So The Serpent in the Sky is still even 40 years later, when was it published? 79, something like that, is still a really valuable introduction to Schwaller. And if the Schwaller bug bites you, then you go and you read the great man himself. And I've given everyone a good head start.
All right. For anybody that just tuned in, we are speaking with John Anthony West. You can find his website at jawest.net. If you want to order any of his stuff, and I do suggest you order the DVD series, what you do is you email him via the website jawest. You made a nice DVD series, is that correct?
Yes, that is very correct. Actually, I might as well put in a plug for myself here.
Sure, go ahead.
That I also lead intensive study tours to Egypt, and I often tell people, I often start lectures because everybody's fidgeting around and getting in their seats. So I start a lecture off by saying that Egypt is like sex. As soon as I say that, I have everyone's attention. And they want to know, why is Egypt like sex? Well, it's because you can read all about it. That's interesting. I mean, Serpent in the Sky and lots of other good books on Egypt, Schwaller himself. You can read a lot and get a lot out of it. You can look at pictures. That's graphic and also very interesting. But the truth of the matter is that, as with sex, until you've experienced it, you really don't understand it. So with my trips, actually, what these trips are, I mean, these are not head trips. They're experiential. And at the end of a couple of weeks in Egypt, you understand anybody, unless you're emotionally defective and spiritually dyslexic, anybody with emotional faculties still functioning understands the difference between what we call progress and what I call shiny barbarism, and what actually was in Egypt a great, great, great civilization, and important, more important than any of the other ancient civilizations, not necessarily because it was more advanced than, say, China or India or Mesoamerica, any of the other great, great civilizations that we've had on Earth, but because there is so much left of it that you can still experience.
Mm-hmm.
You can go to India, you can go to China. There's nothing that goes back to 2,000 and 3,000 BC, and even much further, according to our own work on the Sphinx. So Egypt has that. Egypt has that, is singular, is unique in that sense that you can go there. And of course, in certain of the other civilizations, there's no Schwaller to explain everything to you. And with me as in Schwaller's case, with me as his faithful disciple, you might say.
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, so I lead those trips to Egypt, and next best thing to going to Egypt. I mean, it's not a cheap trip. It's not overpriced, but it's not chump change. And so the Magical Egypt series, those eight DVDs, is as close as you can come to experience in Egypt as you can get without actually being there.
All right.
I don't hesitate to say that. That's the work of my brilliant partner in this, to put it all together and edit it and put. I mean, it was one-man band, so it's really, let's say, from a technical point of view, it's not high end in terms of visuals and so on, because we simply didn't have the equipment or the finances to do a major studio type job. But in terms of getting a picture of Egypt and what it represents and where Egypt's greatness lies, there really isn't anything quite like it anywhere. So I recommend it, surprisingly enough.
Yeah. You mentioned the Sphinx.
Yes.
And I believe Robert Schoch also comes into the picture. Is that correct?
Yes, that comes to the picture. And you pronounce his name correctly, as it would have been in Dutch. But
yeah.
He just calls himself Schoch.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but actually you're correct. That's how it should be pronounced. Anyway, yeah, the Schwaller writing The Serpent was a major undertaking of its own. But in doing my research for Serpent in the Sky, there was a long chapter in one of Schwaller's ancillary books, or secondary books, you might say, written shortly before he died, called Sacred Science. In English, it's now translated as Sacred Science, the King of the Pharaonic Theocracy. And in this book, Schwaller had a long chapter in which he discusses the textual evidence that Egypt went back much, much further than it's given credit for by today's academics, who I call quackademics for the most part. And wait, I'm just going to look at. Dog is barking at something outside. I live in the wilderness here, actually, so
that's awesome.
There's deer all over the place, and the Indians could live here again. Anyhow, so Egypt is Schwaller was accessing the scholars of the Greco-Roman period, around the time of Jesus and Julius Caesar, who were getting their information from the Egyptian priests of the day. Yeah. Egypt was in its steep decline. This is Ptolemaic Egypt, which stretched from 300 BC to the death of Cleopatra in whatever it is, 30 AD. I forget exactly what it is. Anyhow, and they were all talking about what they had learned, that Egypt stretched back much, much further. And Schwaller also was using as evidence two actual documents. One was a stone tablet called the Palermo stone, because it was kept at Palermo in Italy. It had nothing to do with Palermo. And then another papyrus called the Turin papyrus, which of course has nothing to do with Turin, Torino, but is ancient Egyptian.
Yeah.
And these had accounts of long periods, thousands and thousands of years, during which Egypt was ruled first by the Necheru, which means basically the gods themselves. But the gods are not figments of superstition, as the quackademics would have us believe. They are the embodiments of cosmic principles. Egypt is a sacred science, not figments of primitive imagination, elaborately described. And then more thousands of years, when Egypt was ruled by the Shemsuhar, which means the companions or the followers of Horus. And when you computed all of the dates, because they gave the regnal years of these rulers, you got something like 30-something thousand years ago. Of course, to the quackademics, this was anathema, since they think that prior to the rise of Egypt and the other civilizations of China and India, roughly of Mesopotamia, around 3500 BC, there was no civilization at all. And prior to 10,000 BC, everything is hunter-gatherers, and that's the end of it. You know, there's no civilization in our sense. There are no atom bombs. There's no striped toothpaste. There's no Disneyland. It's all barbarism back then. Anyway, so Schwaller has this long chapter, and then he's talking about Palermo stone and the Turin papyrus, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, at the end of the chapter, he says, and of course, the Great Sphinx of Giza shows unmistakable signs of aquatic erosion, in other words, water weathering. And when I read that, that was my little revelation or hypothesis formation, whatever you want to call it, because Schwaller evidently didn't realize himself how revelatory that observation was, because the rest of his argument was textual. And I mean, it's not science. You can argue from now doomsday over, let's say, a passage of the Bible or a passage from Shakespeare. You can't turn it into science. There are better and worse explanations, but none of it counts as science. Whereas the weathering to the Sphinx, either it's water weathering or it's not water weathering, or different kinds of weathering. And I realized that that was a bombshell, because I'm not a geologist, but I knew a little bit about paleoclimatology, ancient climate in Egypt. And the Sahara, as far as I knew, and this turns out to be correct, is a relatively new desert. Prior to 10,000 BC, it was mostly fertile savanna with periods of lots and lots of rainfall. And since 10,000 BC, it's been mostly desert with a few relatively short periods where there was more rainfall. So the Great Sphinx of Giza is the most spectacular sculpture on Earth. I don't think anybody would argue about that. And if it is weathered by water, it would mean that it must have been there already or was carved during periods of intense rainfall, when there was, anyway, lots of water in Egypt. I made one big mistake in The Serpent in the Sky, because I had to do my own geological homework. So I assumed that the water weathering to the Sphinx, and this I had from a geologist. He said, yes, of course. I showed him a picture. That's all in the Mystery of the Sphinx video with Charlton Heston, that it was water weathered. I assumed it was floodwaters of some sort. But it turns out not to have been that. It turns out to have been lots and lots of rain. The pattern of erosion, of weathering to the Sphinx, is such that it can only have been formed by lots and lots of rain. Anyway, what this means, and see, this is not just a quibble among academics, because I realized when I read that single line from Schwaller that in and of itself, that would mean that everything anyone had ever learned in any university or high school or postgraduate course in the world about ancient history was completely wrong, because it had to be, and the arguments about the dating, we still can't date it, but Schock, who was originally being very, very conservative about this, is now a lot less conservative. I was saying from the get-go that if the Egyptians are saying that their own civilization dates back to 30-something thousand BC, they know a lot more about their own history than a bunch of quackademics in the 21st century know. And so I was going with that extreme date, but there's plenty of, let's say, wiggle room in between. The implications, what's important about the dating is not so much the dating itself, but rather we're talking about the most spectacular sculpture on the face of the earth at a time when there's supposed to be only, primitive hunter-gatherers. Not only the Sphinx itself as a sculpture, but the temples in front of it and adjacent to it do not look spectacular compared to other Egyptian temples of the later period, but they're built of blocks of stone weighing upwards of 100 tons, sometimes more than 100 tons, sometimes a couple of 100 tons, slotted together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, so finely that you can't get a credit card in between the joints.
Okay, that doesn't sound like hunter-gatherers to me.
This is very clever hunter-gatherers, exactly. And when we did the Mystery of the Sphinx, we went to a project where they were working with the biggest cranes in the world, land-based cranes in the world, building a cogeneration plant in Long Island. And we have an interview with Jesse Warren, who's the project manager of that, who was absolutely mind boggled by the photographs we had. And he acknowledged that with the biggest crane that we now have, they could lift those blocks, but he couldn't figure out how they would rig them in order to place them the way that they are in fact placed. So in fact, what this means is not only were there great sculptors capable of producing the most spectacular sculpture on earth at a time when there's not supposed to be any civilization at all, but this non-civilization of hunter-gatherers had at their disposal a technology that we absolutely do not understand today, capable of producing architecture that we can't produce. So this is why, when I said before that this is revelatory. In other words, this means that everything you've ever been taught about ancient civilizations and the rise of civilizations has to be thrown completely out the window. So this is a big deal. And of course, we've been fighting this battle with the quackademic community since the 90s. Well, since the video came out. I've been battling them since 1979 when the book came out. But then it wasn't even a battle. They were just ignoring me. And now,
nice dog.
I don't know what Sabu's barking about. Anyway, it's all right. That's a bit of real life.
It's no problem. So the shape of this statue is in a lion or a lioness, right? Does it have anything to do with the animals walking around there, or does it have to do more with the stars in the sky?
Probably both.
Probably
both. We think we're convinced, but it's this is the sort of thing you have to be careful with this. We cannot prove that it's meant as a Leo marker. What you can prove is that it is a lion's body. We're very certain that the head is too small for the body and it's probably been recarved. It might have originally just been a lion. We don't know, and there's no way to find out. But it faces directly due east, which means that on the spring equinox, the lion, if the lion were looking at his own image in the sky, in other words, the age of Leo, the last age of Leo, the last time that Leo rose to the east, due east, was around 10,500 BC. For reasons, people like Graham Hancock and Boval have been talking about that as the most likely date for the Sphinx. We think, Jacques and myself and some others, that the Egyptians themselves, with their rule by the Neteru and rule by the Shamsuhor, we're more inclined to think, and Jacques has more or less come over to this point of view now, even if he prefers not to talk about it publicly, because as a scientist, he's correct to be as conservative as he possibly can be in terms of the data, of what the data will permit. But we're more inclined to see it as the precessional age before 10,000 BC, which would be around 36,000 BC, which does correspond to those the Palermo stone and the Turin papyrus. So it's not as though we're inventing this out of thin air. There's a certain amount of, let's say, of Egyptian evidence that would back up that contention. So anyway, you can see, what this does to our current view of progress as beginning with stupid old cavemen back in whatever it was, the Paleolithic and early Neolithic hunter-gatherers, and leading to our glorious civilization where we're poisoning the earth and skies and seas in front of our noses, and the whole thing is now actually, as we say, I mean, it's hard to read the news on any given day and see anything but a descent into absolute chaos.
Yeah.
So the model of a true great civilization that had its act together, and now we get into the philosophy and the esotericism of it. I'll come to that in a second, actually. But we actually can dispense with the view that for all of the garbage that we've infused our own personal lives with, the collective lives with, it wasn't always that way. And in fact, my own conviction is that unless we reinvent the ancient civilizations in a formulation that's consistent with our own 21st century minds, there's no hope for civilization at all. If we continue along the path that we're going, this whole thing is going to implode and explode, and maybe pretty quickly. And now we get into the symbolist school of Egyptology itself, as Schwaller describes it, to avoid strictly particular religious terminology, which throws people for a loop. If you happen to be a Christian and somebody's talking Buddhist or vice versa, all of a sudden there's a big argument going. So the way Schwaller described it was that Egypt was a one-issue civilization. I mean, one central idea fueled the 3,500 years of known Egyptian history, and in all likelihood went back a lot earlier than that, because it's hard to imagine the Sphinx and the attendant adjacent temples as being simply the whim of genius artists. It was itself based upon a profound knowledge of not only of cosmic principles, but how to, let's say, make use of those cosmic principles in personal and in collective lives. Egypt is a one-issue civilization. This is not to say that people didn't fall in love or have wars, the usual stuff that we put up with in our daily lives, or that we're subject to in our daily lives. But it's a one-issue civilization, and that issue is the quest for immortality, for eternal life. It doesn't mean that the body lives forever. It means that we, through our own inner work, individually and collectively, arrive at a state of consciousness that does not die when our body dies. This is, of course, the basis of all the religions, however corrupt they may be in their institutionalized forms, which they are, all of them, some worse than others. But Egypt, managed, even though it was on a downhill track from early on, it's a big mystery, actually. It was at its height, very close to its beginning. And by the time the Romans, took over, it was corrupted and weakened and so on. Even so, it was still recognizable. A priest of the Old Kingdom, say 3000 BC, would have been understood, or had the same knowledge, let's say, had the same doctrine that a priest in the time of Julius Caesar and Jesus would have had. So in other words, it lasted 3,000 years. Ours is 250 years old, and it's disappearing by the day. At least everything that was any good about it is disappearing.
This ties to the Book of Duat, is that correct?
Yeah, the Book of the Duat is one of the funerary texts, which are effectively, these are, you might say, they're guidebooks. They're guidebooks to the life of the spirit, to the journey through, let's say, the journey through the night, which is taken metaphorically. I mean, after death, originally probably there weren't these funerary texts. You were supposed to get your work done, your inner work done while you were still alive. That's actually in Christianity, that's the doctrine of salvation. Christianity threw out the idea of reincarnation, which is, of course, what's practiced in Buddhist and Hindu doctrine,
Yeah.
but it was there in the first place. I mean, they had to formally declare it heretical in the Council of Nicaea, which is modern day Nice, and I think the date is 350 or 353
Yes, correct.
AD.
Yeah.
So it was there to begin with, and that was Egypt. And actually, in terms of civilizations, it's not too difficult to really get a good fix. To understand what a civilization is, and what one of the first things you have to do is not read history, or anyway take history with many grains of salt. But yet any civilization, any society is pretty easy to understand in terms of its inner life. All you have to do is look at what it does with its creative energy. So with Egypt, it's a good object lesson because there's so much of it left. You can see that whatever was going on in daily life, its creative energy went into the quest for immortality. All the temples, all the tombs, all the pyramids, in one way or another, even all of the arts and crafts were transformational in nature. And this occupied the bulk of their creativity. If you look at us today, let's say 60%, I'm inventing the figures, but there's lots of discussion. They're not really invented. I just couldn't back them up exactly with data. Let's say 60 to 70% of our creative capacity now goes into science in one way, shape, or form, or technology, weapons of mass destruction, out for most of our human history. Another 25 or 30% goes into, you might say, into frivolity, into entertainment. Entertainment I describe as something that you do to kill time before it kills you.
Yeah.
That's entertainment. That's Disneyland and most of Hollywood and so on. A couple of percent goes into stuff that's really useful, into medicine and into, let's say, into cosmological science and the and the sciences, chemistry, all of the normal sciences, but not an awful lot of that stuff is actually beneficial to us, either on the external or on the internal level. So that's the difference between what I call shiny barbarism and a civilization. The civilization occurs when enough people have a sense of what they're on Earth for, which is the quest for immortality, and are doing their best individually and collectively to realize that quest. It's not just in their heads, they have to be doing it.
All right. So what I'm getting from what I've studied so far from ancient Egypt is that they seem to be much more advanced than we are told by the so-called academics, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, but then also I hear that they didn't have a wheel. Is that correct?
Well, not quite. They had a potter's wheel.
Oh, okay.
Until they brought the horses in and the chariots, they didn't have a wheel, but they didn't need one.
Oh,
because
yeah.
They went on the river. They went up and down this long, thin country on the river.
Yeah.
In fact, a wheel would have been, as far as transport, would have been useless because the floods came every year and would have washed the roads away.
Okay.
So they didn't need the wheel for what we use it for.
Okay, now and another thing I wanted to ask, because time is flying, really.
It goes.
There is also pyramids found in South America and China. And how do we view this? Is this like there was a one world culture thousands of years ago, or what do we read from this?
Couple of things, actually. One, it's a big mystery why they would build pyramids in the first place. We don't know why they built them in Egypt, and for the most part, we don't know why they built them in China or different in Mesoamerica. So there's something, as I said, we really don't know why.
Okay.
And they occupy a kind of a latitudinal belt. They're not somewhere around 30 degrees of the latitude, and almost all of them, and they're all over the place, they keep finding new ones, are in that belt. Somebody knew something and erected these strange structures, more or less in a line with each other, and not far to the south and not far to the north. We don't know why, but yes, not necessarily just because of the pyramids, but there are lots and lots of other reasons to postulate a global civilization that went down under cataclysmic conditions, two separate cataclysmic conditions. My colleague Robert Chalk is very much into this aspect of it, and he's got the science credentials behind him to actually pursue it, and I don't. And my interests are more the philosophical and spiritual sides of it anyway. But to say, how shall I say it? There's an event that happens around 11,000 BC, probably a comet or some sort of an asteroid or something that penetrates the atmosphere, and actually the ice age is in full swing at that time. Creates an even colder ice age for about 1,000, 1,200 years. And then all of a sudden something happens, and this is getting a lot of scientific credibility behind it. Something happens. Chalk is pretty well convinced, and there's a physicist named Anthony Perrott, who works at Los Alamos, the government space laboratory, who are getting convinced, and they're not the only ones who've thought of this, but Perrott's work and Chalk's is, you might say, they have the most scientific credibility to be putting forth this theory of CMEs, coronal mass ejections. In other words, these gigantic sunspot storms, electrical storms. Do you know about those?
Yes.
The last one, which is minor by, let's say, by paleoclimatological standards, the last one was called the Carrington event, because I guess he was a guy in England a guy named Carrington who determined what it was that was creating these extraordinary things that were going on in the sky. And this was in 1859. It was as I said, by cosmic standards, this was minor, but it was enough to completely fry everything that was electric in 1859, which is not much. Mostly it was the telegraph lines. Nature. But these things happen. These are, the solar storms that pop up every now and again. And even today, these little bitty minor blips will destroy, will black out the city. Montreal had it happen a few years ago. But the Chalk's conviction, and Perrott's as well, is that this happens periodically, not necessarily cyclically. I mean, you can't, at least we don't know enough about it to say it's every 3,000 years or it's every 12,000 years, or, there's no real schedule for it. But there's plenty of evidence that very severe ones have happened in the past. And so around 9600 BC, 9700, there is one of these tremendous events. And strangely enough, that's the date that Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis. We don't think there is an Atlantis as a specific site in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean or anywhere else, but we think that it's a name applied by the ancients to a global civilization that went down when this tremendous coronal mass at CME took place. And there are petroglyphs. This is Chalk's department, and Perrott's as well. I think it was Perrott who really discovered it, that petroglyphs that go way, way, way back, primitive rock carvings that are remarkably similar the world over, in that they usually portray, and very roughly incised, animals, reindeer, for example, in Norway. Chuck and I were just recently in Norway, elephants and giraffes in Africa or elsewhere. The different animals that would be present in these various civilizations. And then what they have in common are geometric figures, all kinds of geometric figures, labyrinths, spirals, all sorts of things of that nature. Up in the sky, what look like stick figures, human stick figures, but weird ones, some with 6 arms or 3 heads or apple heads, all kinds of very strange things. And the hypothesis is, it still is very much hypothetical, and this is chalk we were looking at when we were just in Norway, and Parad has done a big study, 130 countries or something of that sort. And they're showing these, they have that in common. All of these different petroglyphs have these strange stick figures, which is very strange. That's right. And for the Carrington event, that's 1859. There is photography at that time.
Yeah.
But not good enough so that anybody could take pictures of what they were seeing in the sky. But when people drew what they saw in the sky, it was very similar to those stick figures.
Huh.
So yeah, it may be that a big major chunk of mystery is in the process of being solved.
Yeah, yeah. Can you tell me anything about the Dogon people?
Well, yeah. This again, are you familiar with Laird Scranton's work?
Well, I did hear his name while I was researching you,
Well,
but I hadn't gotten the time to look further into him.
Well, that's you should, and you should get Laird. He's a good friend. He lives near me, actually, in Albany. And Laird initially got interested. He's an expert in computer languages. He's not, a scholar or an archaeologist by trade, but he got interested in looking into the whole mystery of the Dogon and why they should know about Sirius B, about the dwarf star that revolves around Sirius.
Yeah.
And there were rumors somewhere, and I forget exactly where it was, might be the Dogon themselves, who said that their knowledge, they have a very elaborate cosmology that's not dead. In other words, they have high priests of the Dogon who make a construction called a granary that has all kinds of symbolic figures on it. And so Laird got interested to see if indeed there was a link to Egypt, to the Egyptian cosmology, which is also pretty well understood and expressed mythologically and symbolically.
Yeah.
And he started finding that there were very distinct, lots of correspondences that way. And the Dogon are a long way from Egypt. They're all the way in the west of Africa, and a little, tribe by up in Mali, I guess it is. There's no known connection between them. But I think it is the Dogon themselves, who said that there was this connection to Egypt. Anyway, so Laird started studying those. And then just out of curiosity, he checked to see how these cosmologies stacked up against the newest wrinkles in our cosmology, and quantum theory and string theory and torsion theory and all these things. And Laird's not a physicist, but he's a very smart guy. And he started finding not only that the correspondences were striking, and even the figures that came out of the nuclear research laboratories of, let's say, electron streams or electron beds, whatever you call them, same figures. I mean, being photographed by whatever, super microscopes they're control now, looked like both the Dogon and the Egyptian symbols for that stage of cosmology, for that stage of Genesis, as it were. So this has set him on this extraordinary quest, which is now, I guess, 5 or 6 books into it, where once he published his book, originally called The Science of the Dogon, and with the symbols of the Dogon. Anyway, a few of the books, they were never bestsellers, but they attracted a fair amount of attention of people who were interested in these ancient cosmologies. So gradually, book by book, he's been able to show, and I'm not sure that every single one of his parallels is exactly the truth, but science is like that. There's nothing that's exactly the truth. There are plenty of exceptions to the second law of thermodynamics. So if you're not 100% right, doesn't mean just because you're a little bit don't have 5% right, you throw out the other 95%.
Mm-hmm.
No. So what Laird's work, in a nutshell, what he's been able to show is that this cosmology, which was common to both the Dogon and the Egyptians,
Mm-hmm.
is everywhere. The Buddhists have it, and the latest book is showing that the Chinese have it or had it. So this is, in my view, this is really important work, and one of its advantages is that Laird is a very is a good writer. I mean, he's able to explain complex things in language that anybody can understand. You don't need PhDs in physics to be able to understand what he's talking about. So this is really important work, and it harkens back. You see, most of the ancient myths all over the world, including the Bible, talk about the Tower of Babel. Talks that, you know, prior to whatever it was, some catastrophic event, I forget the exact language, but all humanity was had a common language.
Yeah, so that's what the Indian myths also say from India.
That's right. Yeah. They all say that, and I think through Laird's work, we can now say that the common language was not necessarily Turkish or Peruvian or anything like that. It was cosmology. Everybody seems to have had. African tribes have it. Eskimos have it. All sorts of things. It relates to a certain extent. Another sort of important book in all of this, which doesn't get into what Laird gets into, but you probably know that one, Hamlet's Mill, by the two historians, MIT historians of science, Giorgio de Santillana and Herta van Dekend, where they're showing that there's a common astronomical knowledge pervading the legends and the myths of the entire world. They're historians of science, so they don't broach the possibility of astrology, but there's really no point in having a highly developed astronomy without an astrology, because you don't need a highly developed astronomy to tell you when you got to plant the corn or when is the time to fish for salmon. But he does that. So anyway, that's Laird's work, and so that adds, as far as I'm concerned, it adds a big piece to the puzzle that's now starting to take really substantive shape.
Yeah,
we know a lot more now than we did when Schwaller was writing.
Okay, yeah.
About these aspects of the ancient civilization, and Schwaller, meanwhile, provides the intellectual means for appreciating the esoteric doctrine that pervaded in all of those ancient civilizations. And actually, Gurdjieff, for those who resonate to his methods, Gurdjieff provides the means to practice the ancient, you might say, the ancient wisdom within the context of our 21st century lunatic asylum.
Yeah. Another thing that makes me think that they must have known much more, and I haven't gone there myself to check if this is correct, but there's this Nabta Playa. There are all these stones over there.
That's right.
And this one person in the video explained to me that these seem to be randomly placed at a certain point, but that it had actually to do with star distances.
Yeah, that's Tom Brophy. That's Thomas Brophy, who's a physicist and archaeoastronomer.
Yeah. So you wonder how did they know how far these stars were away, right?
With Brophy, there are kind of three levels of his book, of the Origins map. I wrote the foreword to it, or I wrote the afterword to it, and Chuck wrote the foreword. Very interesting. I mean, the first part, there's no mistaking that it's got the belt of Orion and so on.
Yes.
When he's talking about the distances of the stars and the speed at which they're traveling, all I can say is maybe, but I'm not 100% convinced of that.
All right.
in part because I'm not sure that how they would make use of that, but that doesn't.
All right.
I'm not sure. I mean, the Great Pyramid, the star shafts, even the quackademics now acknowledge that they're star shafts, not ventilation shafts.
Yeah. All right.
Particular stars. Why? I mean,
yeah. Why indeed?
Go to all that trouble to? Some people have radio engineers have suggested, and I think makes sense. I mean, I'm not a radio engineer, so I know enough just to acknowledge when I don't know. But they've thought that those shafts would serve in some way or another as waveguides, in which, let's say, that whatever the vibrations that are coming from the belt of Orion or the star Sirius might be, or whatever importance they might be, that would be a way of directing them, in this case, into the Queen's Chamber and into the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
What end, we don't know. But what you can say, you can ballpark it. Strangely enough, there was a big documentary done by, it was either National Geographic or one of the Smithsonian, one of those guys, a few years back, in which they're talking about the pyramids as the pyramids as immortality machines. And then there was a kind of an implicit wink, wink, nod, nod. So, as if these jackasses at the Smithsonian and at the National Geographic knew more than the ancient Egyptians who were building the pyramids.
Yeah.
But in fact, I think that's probably correct. Except that the Egyptians knew what they were doing, and the contemporary quackademics who are winking and winking and nodding haven't a clue. This, by the way, is a point. This is really a point that that should be made. Whenever you read anything, whenever you get it in school or university or graduate course, and they're talking about ancient civilizations and the mythologies and the legends and so on, and the symbolism, they've always saying, I can't think of a single instance where they've said otherwise. The Egyptians believed this, and the Egyptians believed that, or the Peruvian, the Incas believed this. Not once have I ever read them say, or heard them say, hey, maybe they actually knew what they were doing. And as you stupid jackasses who don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, it's like they say, well, the ancient Egyptians believed this. In other words, it's not true. That's how they bring it, right?
And even the language is very important. Myth is often used as, even by people who should know better, is used as a synonym for a lie or a fabrication.
Yeah, that's incorrect.
In fact, what myth actually is a means of describing in dramatic fashion the interplay of cosmic principles. It is actually an extraordinarily advanced, complex science on many, many levels.
Yeah, myth is the first science, right?
Well, it really is.
Yeah.
And it's a way of expressing it so that everyone can understand it. Whereas with us, at the high levels of quantum physics and string theory and all that sort of stuff, only the mathematicians can understand each other. And for
yeah,
that's right.
That's useless, isn't it?
Well, at least they understand it, or sort of. They're limited as well because they don't understand that consciousness, cosmic consciousness, is at the basis of all of this stuff. So anyway,
all right, we are 1 hour gone.
Yeah, I think we've had it's about enough for today, don't you?
Yeah, I had more notes that I wanted to discuss with you, but don't worry about it.
As I warned you, I'm very long-winded.
It's okay, it's okay. Make another plug for yourself before we end this.
Okay. Yeah, well, as I've been talking at very verbosely and at great length for this last hour or so, Egypt is the place. Until you've been to Egypt, you don't actually understand how a true civilization comported itself, and how it, in other words, how it felt. We don't have any. We have almost no civilization of our own in that ancient sense of the word. So if you can possibly afford it, and if And as I said, you'll find it on my website. It's competitive in price, as it were, but it's still, it's not going to the movies. Go to Egypt. Join me on one of my Egypt trips. The next one is October 23rd to November 5th.
All right.
And if you can't do that, at least get yourself Serpent in the Sky and the mystery of the Sphinx, and probably best of all, the 8-episode Magical Egypt, a Symbolist tour.
Yep. If you want to get this, people, visit the website jawest.net and send them an email with your wishes, and we'll get it from there, right?
Yeah, and my email is my initials, JAW, Sphinx, SPHINX, all one word, Jaw Sphinx, at AOL.com.
All right. Thanks a lot.
You're
John.
very welcome.
I think it was awesome.
Thank you. And see what happens. Let me know what feedback you get.
I will, sure. I will send you an email with some of the comments that we're getting. Okay?
I appreciate having that.
Thanks a lot, John. Take care, buddy.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.